a terrifying frontier mastermind who survived 11 bullets only to be broken by a theater stage. This is the humiliating paradox of Cole Younger. Once the West's toughest boss, his post-prison life transformed into the most tragic sellout of the modern era. Forced to launch a traveling Wild West show just to secure his next meal, his unyielding pride drew a fatal line. He refused the public's morbid demand to theatrically reenact the bank raid that slaughtered his family. When he declined to commodify his deepest trauma, the entertainment machine swiftly retaliated, driving a genuine legend into absolute bankruptcy. After enduring 25 years in a freezing prison, the aging boss walked into an industrialized world completely stripped of his empire. Forced to launch a traveling Wild West show just to secure his next meal, his unyielding pride drew a fatal line. He flatly refused the public's morbid demand to theatrically reenact the horrific bank raid that had slaughtered his family. He completely declined to play the role of a bleeding circus monkey for the amusement of a paying audience. The retaliation of the capitalist system was swift and merciless. When he refused to commodify his deepest trauma, the crowds immediately turned their backs, driving a genuine legend into absolute bankruptcy and quiet obscurity. Why would a man who had fearlessly stared down the barrels of a dozen lawmen allow himself to be entirely broken and erased by society simply because he refused to play the fool on a theater stage? Born into a prosperous Missouri family in 1844, Thomas Coleman Younger's privileged trajectory was violently shattered by the Missouri-Kansas border war. When Unionist guerrillas murdered his father, Cole didn't seek justice in a corrupt courtroom. He rode into the freezing timberlines to join the Confederate bushwhackers, emerging from the Civil War as a hardened, battle-tested tactician. While Hollywood has spent a century crafting a cinematic halo around Jesse James, the historical reality is that Cole Younger was the heavy iron spine and the undisputed tactical brain of their notorious syndicate. He was a terrifying paradox, a heavily armed killer who read theology and philosophy in his spare time. While Jesse chased cheap newspaper headlines and public adoration, Cole managed the brutal logistics of their empire. Standing over 6 feet tall, he orchestrated heists with the cold-blooded, exacting discipline of a military general executing a hostile corporate takeover. His mind was a steel trap, mapping out escape routes across 3 states with microscopic precision. Under Cole's command, the gang didn't just rob isolated banks, they directly attacked the towering locomotives and impenetrable steel vaults of the Gilded Age tycoons, forcing the wealthiest men in the nation to cower behind their heavy oak desks. He didn't rob for fame, he robbed for absolute power. But this staggering success triggered a catastrophic reaction. The Eastern establishment pooled their vast resources and unleashed the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, a ruthless, unaccountable private militia. The Pinkertons waged a highly sophisticated war of attrition, weaponizing the crushing poverty of the era with staggering cash bounties to turn lifelong friends into informants. When Cole's tactical brilliance frustrated their efforts, the Pinkertons abandoned all pretense of law enforcement. In a brutal act of state-sanctioned terrorism, they hurled an iron firebomb into the Samuel family farmhouse, killing a 9-year-old boy and maiming Jesse James's mother. The dime novel fantasy of the noble horseback outlaw instantly evaporated. stripped of his sanctuaries and driven to the edge of madness by relentless paranoia, the cornered tactical king of the frontier prepared to make one final desperate strike far outside his Midwestern empire, Northfield, Minnesota. By the late summer of 1876, the relentless, suffocating pressure of the Pinkerton machine had pushed the James Younger Syndicate to the absolute brink of geographic and psychological exhaustion. Missouri, their traditional stronghold and sanctuary, had been transformed into a hostile, heavily surveilled war zone. The rural networks of sympathizers had been irreparably compromised by corporate bounties, and the constant paranoid necessity of sleeping with one eye open in the freezing mud was rapidly eroding their tactical discipline. Driven by a desperate need to replenish their violently depleted financial reserves and a dangerous hubristic desire to strike a target completely outside the Pinkertons' immediate operational grid, the gang made a fateful, catastrophic decision. They would ride north, deep into the unfamiliar freezing territory of Minnesota, far beyond the invisible borders of their Midwestern empire. They believed they were escaping the crushing jaws of the industrial machine. In reality, they were riding blindly into the most devastating blood-soaked meat grinder in the history of the American frontier. The target was the First National Bank in the quiet, prosperous milling town of Northfield, Minnesota. Cole Younger, functioning as the primary tactical architect, had meticulously selected the location based on the arrogant assumption that northern civilians, unhardened by the brutal guerrilla warfare that had defined the border states, would be soft, passive, and easily intimidated by a display of overwhelming armed force. He calculated that the sheer, terrifying reputation of a Missouri outlaw syndicate would be enough to paralyze the town, allowing for a surgical, 5-minute extraction of the vault's capital. It was a strategy that had worked flawlessly across the South and Midwest for a decade. But on the morning of Thursday, September the 7th, 1876, under a heavy, overcast autumn sky, Cole Younger's legendary strategic brilliance suffered a fatal, irreversible collapse. As the heavily armed men crossed the wooden bridge over the Cannon River and rode into the center of Northfield, they wore long, heavy linen dusters to conceal the massive arsenal of Colt revolvers and gun belts strapped to their waists. The atmosphere in the town square was eerily quiet, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and freshly milled flour. Following Cole's precise, pre-orchestrated blueprint, the 8 men divided into 3 distinct operational units. 3 men, including Jesse James, dismounted and casually strolled toward the heavy oak doors of the bank. 2 men took up positions on horseback near the intersection to control the street traffic, while Cole and 2 others remained near the bridge, functioning as the heavily armed rear guard. For a few fleeting minutes, the operation seemed to adhere to the familiar, comforting rhythm of a standard corporate heist. But the fragile illusion of control shattered the moment the front door of the First National Bank swung shut. Inside the marble lobby, the outlaws encountered a terrifying, completely unanticipated obstacle, the unwavering, suicidal defiance of an ordinary clerk. The acting cashier, Joseph Lee Haywood, was not a wealthy tycoon or a hardened soldier. He was a quiet, deeply religious man who simply refused to surrender the vault. When a heavy Colt revolver was jammed violently against his skull, and the men demanded the combination to the safe, Haywood looked calmly down the dark steel barrel and lied, claiming the time lock was engaged. The outlaws beat him savagely, fracturing his skull with the heavy iron frames of their weapons. But the clerk simply absorbed the horrific trauma and refused to speak. The meticulously planned 5-minute surgical extraction was rapidly decaying into a chaotic, desperate hostage situation. Outside on the street, the precise, terrifying machinery of the James Younger gang was simultaneously suffering a catastrophic mechanical failure. Cole Younger, sitting tall in the saddle of his magnificent thoroughbred, his eyes scanning the storefronts with predatory intensity, noticed a sudden, alarming shift in the atmospheric pressure of the town. A local merchant named J.S. Allen had observed the heavily armed strangers entering the bank. Instead of freezing in terror or fleeing for his life, as Cole had so confidently predicted, Allen sprinted down the wooden boardwalk, his voice tearing through the quiet Minnesota air in a frantic, deafening roar. "Get your guns, boys! They're robbing the bank!" The reaction of the Northfield citizenry was not panic. It was an immediate, visceral, and highly coordinated explosion of extreme violence. Cole Younger had fundamentally misjudged the psychology of the northern frontier. These were not soft, passive city dwellers. They were hardened pioneers, Civil War veterans, and fiercely independent merchants who kept loaded fowling pieces, heavy hunting rifles, and shotguns behind every counter and inside every doorway. Within seconds of Allen's desperate warning, the quiet, dusty town square of Northfield was violently transformed into a claustrophobic, deafening, smoke-filled kill zone. Cole instantly recognized that the operation had failed. Drawing his heavy revolvers and spurring his horse into the center of the square, desperately attempting to establish a perimeter and lay down a suppressing field of fire to cover the men trapped inside the bank. He fired into the air, his deep, booming voice echoing over the crack of gunfire, ordering the citizens to get back indoors. But the citizens of Northfield did not retreat. Instead, a torrential, unrelenting hail of lead began to pour down upon the outlaws from second-story windows, hardware store rooftops, and narrow alleyways. The gang was entirely exposed in the wide, unforgiving expanse of the open street, trapped in a fatal crossfire with absolutely zero cover. A medical student named Henry Wheeler, positioned in a second-floor hotel window overlooking the bank, leveled a heavy, borrowed military carbine. With cold surgical precision, Wheeler squeezed the trigger. The massive lead projectile tore through the thick, smoke-filled air and struck Clell Miller, one of Cole's most trusted and lethal lieutenants, directly in the face. The catastrophic kinetic energy of the heavy round instantly shattered Miller's skull, throwing his lifeless body violently backward from the saddle and leaving him to bleed out in the Minnesota dust. Seconds later, a local merchant named A.R. Manning, utilizing a highly accurate breech-loading rifle from behind the cover of a corner store, fired a devastating shot that struck outlaw Bill Chadwell directly through the heart, killing him instantly before his body even hit the ground. In the span of 60 seconds, Cole Younger's meticulously constructed empire was entirely annihilated. The chaotic, deafening roar of overlapping gunshots, the terrifying screams of dying horses, and the thick, blinding clouds of black powder smoke created an atmosphere of pure, unadulterated hell. It was within this specific agonizing crucible that Cole's own physical destruction began. As he rode desperately through the kill zone, attempting to drag the bleeding, shattered bodies of his comrades to safety, the citizens of Northfield concentrated their heavy fire on the towering, unmistakable figure of the gang's tactical leader. The sheer concussive force of 19th century ammunition striking human flesh is a horrific, deeply traumatic event. A heavy lead projectile does not merely puncture, it violently displaces tissue, shatters solid bone into jagged secondary shrapnel, and sends a massive, paralyzing shock wave through the central nervous system. Cole felt the first agonizing impact as a bullet tore cleanly through his left hip, the searing heat of the friction burning the surrounding muscle. He did not fall. He clamped his jaw, the raw adrenaline temporarily masking the devastating pain, and continued to fire his revolvers with mechanical, desperate precision. But the wall of lead was impenetrable. Another heavy rifle round struck him violently in the shoulder, ripping through his heavy wool coat and snapping the collarbone with a sickening audible crack. His left arm instantly went numb, dropping uselessly to his side as the damaged nerves misfired in a blinding wave of agony. Blood poured down his chest, soaking the linen duster in a dark, rapidly expanding crimson stain. Yet, incredibly, the old bushwhacker remained firmly in the saddle, his eyes burning with a terrifying, unyielding defiance. He was an apex predator caught in a trap, and he absolutely refused to die on the dusty streets of a northern milling town. Inside the bank, the remaining outlaws realized the street was lost. In a final cowardly act of pure frustration, they fired a single bullet directly into the skull of the unarmed, defenseless cashier, Joseph Haywood, before scrambling out the back door and sprinting toward their terrified horses. The surviving members of the syndicate, all heavily bleeding and completely disoriented, mounted up and fled Northfield, leaving their dead comrades rotting in the dirt and their legendary reputation permanently shattered. But the escape from Northfield was not a salvation. It was merely the entrance to a prolonged, agonizing purgatory. Cole Younger was bleeding profusely from multiple catastrophic gunshot wounds. The massive loss of blood induced a severe, dizzying hypoxia, blurring his vision and replacing the roaring adrenaline of the firefight with a cold, creeping, deeply nauseating weakness. Under the relentless, freezing downpours of the Minnesota autumn, the remnants of the James Younger gang plunged deep into the dense, unforgiving wilderness, desperately attempting to outrun a massive, heavily armed posse that was swelling to over 1,000 furious, vengeful men for 2 agonizing weeks. Cole endured a level of physical and psychological torture that defies fundamental medical comprehension. He rode through the thick, freezing mud and dense underbrush, his shattered collarbone grinding together with every step of his horse. The open, untreated bullet wounds rapidly became deeply infected. The smell of his own rotting, necrotic flesh filled his nostrils, and a severe burning fever began to boil his brain. He was forced to subsist on raw field corn and muddy puddle water, unable to light a fire to stay warm for fear of alerting the sprawling network of posses that were tightening the noose around them. The legendary tactician, the man who had effortlessly terrorized the tycoons of the Gilded Age, was reduced to a hunted, starving, delirious animal, dragging his rapidly decaying body through the freezing swamps. The inevitable violent conclusion to this grueling death march arrived on the morning of September 21st in a desolate, muddy depression known as Hanska Slough. The younger brothers, Cole, Jim, and Bob, had been entirely separated from the James brothers, who had callously abandoned them in the woods to save themselves. The youngers were surrounded, pinned down in a thicket of dense plum bushes, by a highly organized, heavily armed posse from the town of Madelia. As the posse closed in, unleashing a devastating overlapping volley of rifle and shotgun fire into the brush, Cole Younger did not raise his hands in surrender. He propped his bleeding, exhausted body against a tree, raised his heavy Colt revolver with his one functioning arm, and prepared to die exactly as he had lived, returning fire into the teeth of the enemy. The shootout at Hanska Slough was a brief, incredibly violent execution. The posse poured lead into the thicket with absolute impunity. It was here that Cole's body was subjected to its final unimaginable trauma. A heavy caliber rifle bullet struck him directly in the face, shattering his upper jaw, tearing out his teeth, and lodging deep inside his skull. Another round smashed violently into his torso, breaking several ribs and puncturing his lung, causing him to cough up thick, dark blood with every agonizing, rattling breath. More bullets tore through his arms and legs, shredding muscle and snapping bone. In total, over the course of the Northfield raid and the final stand at Hanska Slough, Thomas Coleman Younger absorbed 11 massive, heavy-caliber gunshot wounds. When the gunfire finally ceased and the heavy smoke slowly cleared from the swamp, the posse cautiously advanced into the brush, expecting to find nothing but shredded corpses. Instead, they found a scene of horrifying, almost supernatural resilience. Jim and Bob Younger were critically wounded, bleeding heavily into the mud, and there, leaning against a shattered tree stump, was Cole Younger. His clothes were entirely saturated in dark, congealed blood. His face was a horrific, unrecognizable mask of torn flesh and shattered bone. He was struggling to breathe through a punctured lung, and his body was experiencing massive, catastrophic shock. By every known metric of 19th century medical science, Cole Younger should have been a rotting corpse. A single one of those heavy rifle wounds possessed the kinetic energy to kill an ordinary man instantly. But Cole did not die in the freezing mud of Hanska Slough. As the posse members stood over him, their rifles still smoking, staring down at the mangled, bleeding ruin of the greatest outlaw in American history, Cole slowly opened his remaining, unswollen eye. He looked up at his captors not with fear, and not with the pathetic relief of a dying man seeking absolution, but with a cold, terrifying, and completely unyielding glare of pure defiance. Surviving the 11 bullets that violently tore through his body was an undeniable medical miracle. But as the authorities roughly loaded his bleeding, shattered frame into a heavy wagon to transport him to the Minnesota State Prison, the brilliant, calculating mind of Cole Younger slowly began to process a deeply horrifying reality. The bullets had failed to grant him the swift, merciful dignity of a warrior's death on the battlefield. Instead, his unnatural, stubborn survival had merely condemned him to an entirely new, infinitely more agonizing phase of existence. The ultimate alpha of the frontier had not been killed. He had been successfully captured alive, and the relentless, unforgiving machine of the modern American era was now eagerly preparing to lock him inside a freezing stone tomb, intent on slowly, methodically extracting a punishment far worse and far more degrading than any simple execution. The heavy iron-reinforced wooden wagons that transported the shattered remnants of the James younger gang did not carry defeated men. They carried heavily bleeding, barely breathing cargo destined for a meticulously constructed limestone purgatory. When the massive rusted iron gates of the Minnesota State Prison at Stillwater violently slammed shut in the freezing autumn of 1876, the deafening metallic clang echoed with the absolute finality of a closing coffin lid. For a man whose entire existence and tactical genius were inextricably bound to the boundless horizons of the American frontier, this was a profound, systematic, psychological amputation. The immediate reality of Stillwater was a gruesome battle for sheer physical survival. The prison hospital of the late 19th century was a primitive, brutal institution. Cole lay on a thin, coarse mattress, his body a torn canvas of 11 heavy-caliber bullet wounds. The extraction of the lead was a procedure of unspeakable, blinding agony. Doctors dug deep into the necrotic tissue with cold iron forceps, while Cole, fiercely refusing to grant his captors the satisfaction of his screams, bit down on a leather strap until his remaining teeth cracked. Several jagged fragments of lead were deemed too dangerous to remove. They were permanently sealed inside his body, transforming him into a living, breathing reliquary of his own devastating defeat. For a quarter of a century, every freezing Minnesota winter that seeped through the porous limestone walls would trigger a blinding agony as the embedded shrapnel ground against his internal scars. However, the physical torment was rapidly eclipsed by the meticulous psychological torture of the penitentiary. Stillwater was a sprawling industrial machine, a literal extension of the capitalist system Cole had fought so violently to dismantle. His legendary identity was entirely erased. Stripped of his name, issued a sequential number, and forced into a degrading striped uniform, he was folded into a silent, anonymous population of the condemned. The brilliant mind that had once mapped intricate escape routes across 3 states was now brutally forced to focus on the mind-numbing, repetitive manual labor of manufacturing twine in absolute enforced silence. The sheer terrifying boredom gnawed aggressively at his sanity. The psychological isolation was weaponized by the excruciating passage of time. Cole was forced to watch his family slowly and agonizingly disintegrate within the very same stone walls. He listened to the rattling coughs of his brother Bob dying of tuberculosis, and watched his other brother Jim plummet into inescapable depression. Yet left entirely alone and carrying the suffocating guilt of the Northfield trap, Cole's reaction to a quarter-century of captivity was a chilling, impenetrable stoicism. He did not riot. He did not surrender to madness. Instead, the former warlord methodically reinvented himself as a model prisoner. He utilized the same terrifying focus he once used to rob trains to master the prison system, eventually becoming the prison librarian and launching a penal newspaper. He survived 25 years by burying his violent nature beneath a flawless, highly calculated mask of compliance, proving that his most lethal weapon was never his revolver, but his unyielding, indestructible mind. While he sat frozen in this temporal vacuum, the world he had once mastered was being entirely eradicated. Through fragmented whispers, Cole learned that the untamed frontier was being systematically conquered by miles of unyielding barbed wire, asphalt roads, and sprawling telephone networks. The Gilded Age tycoons had achieved undisputed victory. This terrifying realization was completely cemented in 1882, when the news of Jesse James's assassination penetrated the prison walls. The corporate machine had not captured Jesse through a heroic shootout. They had simply utilized their bottomless wealth to purchase a betrayal from a coward. For Cole, it was a chilling revelation. Loyalty and physical courage were entirely obsolete commodities. The capitalist system had successfully monetized human betrayal, proving that the outlaw era was not just dead. It had been bought, sold, and slaughtered like cheap livestock. When the Board of Pardons finally signed the conditional release papers in July 1901, opening the heavy iron gates of Stillwater after exactly 25 years, it was not an act of judicial mercy. It was an act of profound, calculated dismissal. The state no longer feared Cole Younger. He had been completely neutralized by the relentless, grinding passage of time. The man who limped out into the blinding sunlight of the 20th century was a haunting, shattered specter. He was 57 years old, his hair stark white, leaning heavily on a wooden cane to support his crippled hip. He wore a cheap, state-issued suit that hung loosely from his shrinking frame, holding nothing but a tiny fraction of release money. The sensory overload of his sudden liberation was entirely paralyzing. Cole stepped out of the silent, highly controlled environment of the penitentiary directly into the roaring, mechanized chaos of the progressive era. The sky above the rapidly expanding cities was choked with thick black factory smoke. The streets were an aggressive, terrifying blur of electric streetcars and the startling metallic roar of early automobiles. The people rushing past him on the paved sidewalks were clerks and factory workers, moving with a frantic urban rhythm. He was a 19th century horseback warlord, abruptly dropped into a hyper-industrialized metropolis, struck by the suffocating realization of his own absolute obsolescence. Desperate to earn a quiet, honest wage, Cole actively sought employment. He limped into modern corporate offices and sprawling lumber yards, offering his formidable administrative skills, his capacity for organized labor, and his unwavering discipline. But the deeply hypocritical, sanitized modern society vehemently rejected him at every turn. Business owners, men who sat comfortably behind clean desks in a world secured by capitalist monopolies, looked at his scarred face and saw only the bloody headlines of dime novels. They saw a highly dangerous, inherently defective liability. The doors were consistently, aggressively slammed in his face. The tycoons had engineered a perfect, inescapable trap. They had shattered his body, buried him alive until his skills were useless. And now the society they built intentionally denied him the fundamental right to earn a survival wage. As his meager funds rapidly evaporated, Cole found himself staring into the terrifying abyss of urban starvation. The cold, brutal reality solidified. The modern era had no use for his tactical genius. The only asset the ravenous new society was willing to exchange for currency was the dark, traumatizing myth of his violent past. Driven by inescapable economic strangulation, Cole did not wait to be forced into the entertainment machine. He actively sought it out. He initiated a bitter reunion with his old comrade, Frank James. Together, these two damaged elderly men approached the aggressive architects of the modern theatrical world. They willingly formed the Cole Younger and Frank James historical Wild West show. For Cole, signing his name to that corporate ledger was an act of profound, crushing irony. He was legally binding himself to the very capitalist system he had spent his youth fighting to dismantle. He was actively trading his terrifying, legendary status for the degrading, brightly lit existence of a performing circus attraction, stepping into a canvas arena to willingly sell his own trauma to the highest bidder just to survive. The logistical construction of the Wild West show was a surreal, deeply insulting mockery of Cole's actual lived experience. The sprawling, untamed frontiers of Missouri and the Indian Territory were violently condensed into a claustrophobic, dusty arena enclosed by cheap wooden bleachers and heavy canvas tents. The authentic, lethal tools of his former trade were replaced by sanitized, theatrical props. The horses provided by the management were not the highly trained, explosive thoroughbreds required for a genuine military ambush. They were docile, predictable animals accustomed to the noise of the crowds and the bright glare of the artificial lighting. The entire environment was a carefully curated, heavily sanitized simulacrum of the frontier, specifically designed to provide a safe, consumable thrill for an urban populace that had never experienced the terrifying, visceral reality of actual violence. When the show finally premiered, the sensory assault of the arena was profoundly disorienting for a man who had spent a quarter of a century in the silent, damp, highly controlled environment of a state penitentiary. As Cole rode out from behind the heavy velvet curtains and into the center of the dirt ring, he was immediately blinded by the harsh, intense glare of the early electrical spotlights. The air was thick and suffocating, choked with the smell of roasted peanuts, cheap cigar smoke, horse manure, and the overwhelming collective sweat of thousands of tightly packed, shouting spectators. The deafening, chaotic roar of the crowd hit him with the concussive force of a physical blow. He looked up into the towering wooden bleachers, his unswollen eye scanning the sea of faces, and experienced a deep, deeply chilling realization. The people staring down at him were the beneficiaries of the new, industrialized American empire. They were factory managers, bank clerks, and urban merchants, the exact demographics that had once lived in absolute terror of his name. But they were not looking at him with fear, and they were certainly not looking at him with respect. Their eyes were wide with a morbid, voyeuristic curiosity. They were gazing at the heavily scarred, limping old man in the center of the ring with the same casual, detached amusement they would afford to a caged exotic beast in a zoological garden. The terrifying, uncontrollable force of the border wars had been successfully captured, domesticated, and placed on display for the low price of a 25-cent admission ticket. Despite the deeply humiliating environment, Cole Younger possessed a fierce, deeply ingrained, and fundamentally barren pride. He was determined to earn his wage through a display of genuine, authentic skill. He had no intention of becoming a theatrical clown. In the center of the arena, he demonstrated the precise, exacting marksmanship that had kept him alive during the brutal guerrilla campaigns of the Civil War. He rode with a rigid, disciplined posture, despite the agonizing, grinding pain in his shattered hip, executing complex equestrian maneuvers that required a lifetime of dangerous practical experience. He wanted to offer the crowd a sliver of the true, unromanticized reality of the frontier, a demonstration of the cold, mechanical proficiency required to survive in a deeply hostile ecosystem. However, the urban audiences of 1903 had absolutely no interest in authentic frontier mechanics. They were fundamentally insulated from the harsh realities of physical survival, living in a rapidly modernizing world of paved streets, police departments, and predictable routines. They did not buy tickets to admire the nuanced tactical discipline of horseback marksmanship. They were entirely conditioned by decades of cheap, blood-soaked dime novels and highly exaggerated newspaper headlines. They were ravenously hungry for sensationalism, melodrama, and the specific mythological violence that they had read about in the safety of their parlors. Genuine skill was profoundly boring to a crowd that had paid to see a monster. The polite, sparse applause that greeted Cole's authentic demonstrations rapidly decayed into a restless, deeply aggressive boredom. The crowd began to murmur, the collective frustration vibrating through the heavy canvas tents. Soon, the murmurs escalated into shouts, and the shouts coalesced into a unified, deafening, and profoundly macabre demand. They began chanting for the blood they had been promised by the lurid promotional posters. They shouted the name of the town that had permanently haunted Cole's nightmares for 3 decades, Northfield. The chilling reality of the crowd's demand struck Cole with a deeply nauseating force. They did not want him to shoot glass targets or demonstrate military horsemanship. They wanted him to meticulously recreate the most devastating, catastrophic failure of his entire life. They wanted the arena lights to dim, and they wanted him to pantomime the horrific, blood-soaked slaughter of the First National Bank. They were actively demanding that the white-haired, heavily scarred old man physically act out the precise moment when a heavy-caliber rifle bullet had shattered his jaw, the exact second his collarbone had snapped under the kinetic impact of lead, and the terrifying, chaotic retreat through the freezing Minnesota mud. More horrifyingly, to satisfy the narrative expectations of the ticket buyers, the reenactment would require him to publicly simulate the deaths of his own brothers. The crowd wanted to watch hired actors, dressed in cheap costumes, fall into the arena dirt, pretending to be Clell Miller, Bill Chadwell, Bob Younger, and Jim Younger. They wanted Cole to actively participate in a cheap, theatrical mockery of the men who had bled out in the plum thickets of Hanska Slough, and the brothers whose tragic fates, Bob's lingering death in the damp cells of Stillwater, and Jim's desperate suicide shortly after his release, still haunted his every waking moment. The urban populace, safe and secure in their industrialized lives, viewed the profound life-destroying trauma of the James Younger gang not as a human tragedy, but as an interactive, highly entertaining carnival game. The pressure from the financial backers of the Wild West show was immediate, ruthless, and entirely devoid of basic human empathy. The promoters cornered Cole backstage in the dark, suffocating spaces between the canvas tents, aggressively waving the declining ledger books in his face. They explained the cold, undeniable mathematics of the entertainment industry. Authenticity did not sell tickets. Blood, tragedy, and sensationalized violence sold tickets. They demanded that Cole abandon his stubborn, unprofitable pride and give the crowds exactly what they were chanting for. They ordered him to load his revolvers with theatrical blank cartridges, to fall off his horse on command, to smear fake blood across his face, and to publicly relive the total annihilation of his family and his empire. twice a day, every day, for the duration of the touring season. If he refused, the financial lifelines would be immediately severed, and the enterprise would collapse. It was within this dark, foul-smelling backstage tent that Cole Younger reached the absolute unyielding boundary of his psychological endurance. He had survived the terrifying explosive violence of the border wars. He had endured the relentless, heavily funded terrorism of the Pinkerton machine. He had absorbed 11 massive rifle wounds without screaming, and he had survived 25 years of sensory deprivation and psychological torture inside a freezing stone cage. He had allowed the state to take his youth, his wealth, and his physical health, but he absolutely refused to allow the entertainment industry to confiscate his grief. The deaths of his brothers, the agonizing screams in the Minnesota mud, and the crushing guilt of the Northfield disaster were not cheap theatrical props to be packaged and sold for the amusement of a detached, bloodthirsty audience. They were profound sacred scars, deeply woven into the very fabric of his shattered soul. To pantomime that specific trauma, to fake his own destruction and mock the slaughter of his bloodline under the glare of circus lights, would be the final, irreversible act of spiritual castration. It would mean that the corporate machine had not only defeated his body, but completely hollowed out his humanity. Standing tall, despite the agonizing pain in his shattered hip, Cole Younger looked the furious, desperate promoters directly in the eyes. With the cold, terrifying, and completely unshakable authority that had once commanded the most lethal paramilitary force on the frontier, he delivered his final, absolute verdict. He flatly, unequivocally refused to alter the performance. He would not participate in a theatrical reenactment of the Northfield raid. He would not fire blank cartridges into the air. He would not fall in the dirt for the crowd's amusement, and he would never, under any circumstances, reduce the deaths of his brothers to a cheap, entertaining pantomime. The barren, unyielding pride of a genuine frontier killer would simply not allow him to become a bleeding circus monkey for a society that had already taken everything else. The immediate brutal consequences of his refusal rapidly demonstrated the terrifying, unforgiving nature of the new American century. In the past, Cole had faced enemies armed with Winchester rifles and heavy revolvers. Now, he was facing an entirely new weapon: absolute, crushing societal apathy. The moment the paying public realized that the legendary Cole Younger was not going to give them the macabre, blood-soaked spectacle they demanded, they simply evaporated. They did not attack the show. They did not riot. They simply stopped buying tickets. They turned their backs on the arena and walked away, seeking their cheap, sensationalized thrills in other, more compliant entertainment venues. The Cole Younger and Frank James historical Wild West show suffered a catastrophic terminal hemorrhage of capital. The massive canvas tents were struck, the hired performers were dismissed, and the entire enterprise spiraled rapidly into inescapable bankruptcy. It lasted less than a single devastating year. The rapid, total collapse of the show was not a failure of logistics or marketing. It was a targeted, calculated execution delivered by the capitalist entertainment machine. This was the ultimate horrifying punishment of the modern era. The system did not need to hang Cole Younger from a wooden gallows, nor did it need to return him to the damp, freezing cells of the state penitentiary. The tycoons and the urban masses had discovered a far more elegant, infinitely more cruel method of destruction. They had reduced a legendary, terrifying historical figure to a mere consumer product. And when that product stubbornly refused to adapt to the morbid demands of the marketplace, when Cole Younger aggressively refused to commodify his own trauma and pain, the society simply deemed him defective. They stripped him of his commercial value, discarded him like a broken, obsolete piece of machinery, and abandoned him to rot in complete, humiliating financial ruin. The old wolf had successfully protected the final battered shreds of his personal pride, but in doing so, he had willingly signed his own economic death warrant, learning the coldest lesson of the industrialized world. A legend who refuses to perform is a legend who is left entirely alone to starve in the dark. Following the catastrophic collapse of the Wild West show, Cole Younger retreated into a deeply humiliating, suffocating obscurity. He spent his final decade as a crippled, heavily scarred relic, forced to engage in the ultimate ironic hustle of the 20th century. The man who had spent his youth aggressively terrorizing banks and destroying financial security was now quietly attempting to survive by selling life insurance to middle-class citizens. Furthermore, he traveled the Midwestern lecture circuit, delivering highly publicized, moralistic sermons under the title "What My Life Has Taught Me," desperately warning young men about the evils of crime. When death finally claimed him on March 21, 1916, it did not arrive with the glorious roar of a Winchester rifle. He died quietly in a nondescript Missouri bed at 72, a broken man who had been forced to peddle insurance and preach morality to the very society that had systematically crushed his empire, his failing body still carrying the rusting lead of the Northfield slaughter. The ultimate chilling tragedy of Cole Younger was not the 11 bullets that violently shredded his flesh, nor the agonizing quarter-century spent buried alive in the Stillwater Penitentiary. His most devastating defeat was delivered by the smiling machinery of the modern entertainment era. The system had realized it no longer needed to execute its monsters. It merely needed to price them. When Cole fiercely protected his final shred of human dignity, refusing to commodify the slaughter of his own bloodline, the system instantly deemed him a defective asset and threw him into the cultural incinerator. Today, the multi-billion-dollar cinematic machine meticulously perpetuates a sanitized illusion. Modern Hollywood eagerly resurrects the James Younger syndicate in sleek dusters, riding fearlessly into romanticized gunfire. They systematically erase the bitter reality of 1903. The silver screen refuses to film the heavily scarred white-haired old man standing in the dirt of a bankrupt circus tent, staring into the apathetic eyes of a crowd demanding he fake his own death for loose change. As the blood-soaked mythology of the American West continues to be packaged and sold, Cole Younger's silent grave leaves behind a cold, deeply uncomfortable echo. It strips away the cinematic glamour to ask one final, unrelenting question. If society offered you salvation strictly on the condition that you make a mockery of your own tragedy, would you sell your soul to the arena, or would you protect your pride and accept being entirely discarded by the world?